Welcome to Iggy's Insights, where we dive deep into economic topics that matter. I'm your host, Iggy, and today we're exploring a perspective that might challenge your thinking about how a tiny island nation quietly became a global powerhouse in one of the most critical industries of our time, semiconductors. Picture this. It's the late 1960s, and the world is on the cusp of a technological revolution. While giants like the United States and Japan are flexing their industrial muscles, a small city-state in Southeast Asia, barely 3 years independent, is laying the groundwork for an economic miracle. That's Singapore, and its story in the semiconductor industry is a masterclass in strategy, resilience, and navigating the choppy waters of global trade. Today, we'll unpack how Singapore rose from a colonial backwater to producing 1 out of every 10 chips powering your phones, cars, and computers, and what this means for you as an investor in a world gripped by a US-China chip war. Let's start with the historical context, because to understand Singapore's semiconductor success, we need to go back to where it all began. In 1965, Singapore was a newly independent nation, kicked out of Malaysia, with no natural resources, a small population, and an economy reliant on entrepot trade, basically moving goods from one ship to another. Unemployment was high, and the future looked grim, but the government, led by Lee Kuan Yew, had a vision. They saw that the world was shifting toward manufacturing and technology, and they wanted a piece of that pie. By 1968, a pivotal moment arrived. National Semiconductor, an American company, set up its first plant in Singapore. This wasn't a fluke. The government had created the Economic Development Board back in 1961, and this agency was tasked with wooing foreign companies with tax breaks, cheap land, and a promise of stability. Soon after, Texas Instruments and Motorola followed suit, planting their flags in Singapore's soil. Why Singapore? It wasn't just the incentives. The government invested heavily in education, churning out a workforce skilled enough to handle the delicate work of assembling microchips. By the 1970s, Singapore was becoming a hub for low-end chip assembly, a labor-intensive process that laid the foundation for something bigger. Now let's build on this. The 1980s brought a turning point. Singapore didn't want to stay at the bottom of the value chain just screwing parts together. They wanted to climb higher. Enter the local industry upgrading program launched in 1986. This was a brilliant move. The government gave local companies financial support to partner with multinationals, helping them shift from assembly to designing and testing chips, tasks that required more skill and paid better. Imagine this like a farmer moving from picking fruit to owning the orchard. By the 1990s, Singapore's semiconductor ecosystem was buzzing. Companies like Creative Technology, known for its Sound Blaster cards, and Chartered Semiconductor, which later became part of Global Foundries, were making waves. Wafer fabrication plants sprang up too, like ST Microelectronics facility in 1995. These plants didn't just assemble chips, they made them from scratch, turning silicon into the tiny miracles that power our lives. This wasn't luck, it was deliberate. The government kept pouring money into research, setting up the Institute of Microelectronics in 1979 to push the boundaries of chip technology. By the time the 2000s rolled around, Singapore had weathered the dot-com bust and SARS, thanks to plans like the National Technology Plan of 2002, which doubled down on high-tech industries. Let's connect this to the present. Fast forward to today, February 23rd, 2025, and Singapore is a titan in the semiconductor world. It produces about 10% of the global supply of chips and 20% of the equipment used to make them. That's staggering for a nation smaller than New York City. Giants like Micron Technology, Global Foundries, and Applied Materials have massive operations here. Micron, for instance, employs thousands and runs multiple plants churning out memory chips, the kind in your phone's RAM. Global Foundries, after buying Chartered Semiconductor in 2009, is a key player in making chips for everything from cars to IoT devices. Applied Materials supplies the machines that carve microscopic circuits into silicon wafers. This isn't just a cluster of factories, it's a full ecosystem. Design, manufacturing, testing, equipment, materials, all humming along. The sector contributes about 7% to Singapore's GDP. A hefty chunk for a single industry. But here's where it gets interesting. This success isn't happening in a vacuum. It's unfolding against the backdrop of a global chip war between the United States and China, a conflict that's reshaping the world economy. To understand this, let's step back to 2019. That's when the US Justice Department indicted Huawei, a Chinese tech giant, accusing it of stealing trade secrets. This wasn't just a legal spat, it was the opening salvo in a technological Cold War. Chips, the beating heart of every modern device, became the battleground. The US slapped Huawei on its entity list, banning American companies from selling to them without special licenses. Then, in 2022, the CHIPS and Science Act poured $52 billion into rebuilding America's own chip industry, while tightening export controls on cutting-edge chips, like the ones NVIDIA makes for AI. China fired back, investing billions to grow its own semiconductor capabilities, though it's still years behind in advanced tech. Where does Singapore fit in? Right in the middle. It's a trusted partner to the US, hosting American firms and aligning with Western tech standards, but it's also a major trade hub for Asia, including China. In 2024, eyebrows raised when NVIDIA reported 22% of its sales billed to Singapore, yet only a fraction of those chips physically landed there. Were they being rerouted to China, dodging US export curbs? A Singapore minister quickly clarified, "No funny business here." Still, the scrutiny's only growing. This brings us to a historical parallel. Think back to the 17th century when the Dutch East India Company dominated global trade. They thrived by controlling key ports and staying neutral in Europe's endless wars. Singapore's playing a similar game today, positioning itself as a stable, neutral hub in a fractured world. But neutrality's tricky when superpowers are at odds. Take the Opium Wars of the 19th century. Britain and China clashed over trade, and small players like Hong Kong got caught in the crossfire, reshaped by the outcome. Singapore's not Hong Kong, it's sovereign and savvy. But the lesson holds. When giants fight, the little guys need to be nimble. And Singapore is. Just look at Prime Minister Lawrence Wong's budget speech on February 18, 2025. He pledged 1 billion Singapore dollars, about 747 million US dollars, to build a new chip research center focused on AI and quantum computing. This isn't a reaction, it's a proactive strike to stay ahead. Between 2021 and 2025, the government's already sunk 18 billion Singapore dollars into R&D, and the refundable investment credit introduced in 2024 is luring more firms. Micron, for example, pumped 1.5 billion US dollars into expanding its Singapore plants in 2022, betting on the island as a safe bet amid global chaos. Now, let's break down how these historical patterns apply today. The semiconductor industry's growth mirrors the industrial revolutions of the past. In the 18th century, Britain leapt ahead with steam engines because it had coal, iron, and a government willing to back innovation. Singapore's equivalent is its strategic location, skilled workers, and a state that's not afraid to spend big. But there's a catch. Today's chip war adds a layer of complexity the Industrial Revolution never faced. Back then, trade was about goods, cotton, steel, tea. Now it's about technology, and control over chips means control over the future. The US wants to keep China from catching up, while China's racing to close the gap. Singapore's caught in this tug of war, but it's also capitalizing on it. Companies are diversifying away from China, a China plus one strategy, and Singapore's reaping the rewards. Its stability, strong intellectual property laws, and world-class infrastructure make it a magnet for investment. Yet, the risks are real. President Trump's threat of 25% tariffs on semiconductor imports floated in early 2025 could hit Singapore hard. If the US sees Singapore as a weak link in its export controls, pressure could mount. Let's address a common misconception, that Singapore's success is just about cheap labor or tax breaks. That was true in the 1960s, but not now. Labor costs in Singapore are high, higher than in Malaysia or Vietnam. Taxes are low, sure, but the real edge is the ecosystem. The government's partnered with companies like Global Foundries and Micron to train workers through the Institute of Technical Education, ensuring a steady flow of talent. Research hubs like A-STAR's Institute of Microelectronics keep innovation alive. This isn't a race to the bottom, it's a climb to the top. Another myth? That Singapore's too small to matter. Size doesn't dictate influence here. In the 15th century, Venice was a speck on the map, yet it ruled Mediterranean trade with smart alliances and a strong navy. Singapore's modern navy is its policies and partnerships, keeping it relevant in a globalized economy. So what does this mean for you, the viewer? Let's talk actionable insights. First, recognize the stakes. Semiconductors aren't just tech, they're economic power. The global market's set to soar, driven by AI, 5G, and the Internet of Things. Singapore's well placed to ride that wave, but volatility's baked in. If you're an investor, diversification is your friend. Don't bet everything on one country or company. Singapore's semiconductor stocks, like those tied to Micron or Global Foundries, offer stability, but keep an eye on U.S. policy shifts. Tariffs or tighter export rules could ripple through the sector. Second, think long-term. Singapore's sinking billions into AI and quantum computing, fields that'll define the next decade. Companies involved in those areas could be gold mines down the road. Third, watch the energy angle. Chips are power hungry. By 2030, the industry might eat up 20% of global electricity. Singapore is pushing green tech to stay sustainable, so firms tackling that challenge might be worth a look. Let's wrap this up with the big picture. Singapore's semiconductor rise shows how a small player can punch above its weight with vision and grit. From National Semiconductor's first plant in 1968 to today's cutting-edge research, it's a story of adaptation. The US-China chip war is a wild card, but Singapore's not standing still. That $1 billion R&D center isn't just a building. It's a statement. We're here to stay. For investors, this is a chance to learn from history. Just as the Dutch thrived by mastering trade routes, Singapore's mastering the supply chains of tomorrow. But the game's not over. Competition's fierce. America, Europe, even Malaysia are in the ring. Geopolitical tensions could shift the board overnight. Stay sharp, stay informed, and you might just spot the next big opportunity in this Silicon saga. That's all for today's Iggy's Insights. If you like this deep dive, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what economic topic you want next. Until then, keep your eyes on the markets and your mind on the history shaping them.